of these tables do you believe will be easier to fit through a narrow door? How do the shapes of the tables compare? So if you were to pick one and say it was easier to get through a door, which one would you say? Why?
The one on the right?
So,
no, the other one. Because you can
this
just turn
one.
it sideways, right?
okay. Anybody else? Thank
That's
you.
a big reason.
Why?
They both have the same legs, it's like, either way you have to kind of turn it and like, get into the door. It's
Okay.
the same kind of features.
So you see similar features, and you just have to kind of change it a little bit to get it through the door. Anybody else? Casey?
I think it's possible that we're looking at the picture at a different angle. They could possibly be the same size as the shape.
Right, which is kind of right what AJ is saying, is they really have very, very similar features. Okay, before we move on, anyone else have a different opinion? Philip? The one on the left, so it's your, this one, that's more narrow. Okay. So if you remember, last week, we talked about judgment, right? And what's consistent in how we make judgments, and especially in accounting and auditing, is that there's uncertainty, right? You don't know, because unless you have a ruler and you can take measurements of both of these tables, you have no idea if they're the same dimensions. You don't know anything about the door, you just know that the door is narrow. You don't know how narrow. So there's some uncertainty about the information that's presented to you. And based on that information, you have to make a judgment about whether or not one table is easier to fit through the door than the other. And as you can see, we are all seeing the same picture, right? Well, at least this slide that's up is available to everyone. So everyone has the same amount of information, right? I didn't tell AJ anything differently than I told Casey, right? So everyone had the same information, but yet we came to different conclusions using the same information. And why did we come to conclusions using the same information? Think back to what we talked about last week when we talked about the judgment framework. What are the elements of our judgment process? Yes?
I was gonna say we all have different perceptions.
We have different perceptions. Sorry. Okay, we have different perceptions. So how we frame the problem, right? How we frame what we're seeing could possibly lead us to very different conclusions or approaches. What else? Does anyone here have any experience moving furniture?
No, I thought that was just like, yeah, I moved furniture.
So did that in any way inform your judgment?
Yeah, I guess I looked at how you would just move certain things because I have a small apartment now. Yeah.
So again, your frame was shaped by your experiences, right? So you could imagine, so remember one of the other things that we talked about in the judgment framework is your experience and the expertise that you bring to a task, right? So that is going to shape your judgment. If you see something a lot, or if you've been exposed to something a lot, that does influence how you approach solving a problem. So there's a reason why experience matters. There's a reason why, as you gather more experience, you can improve your judgment on a repetitive task, right? Something that you've done a lot, the more you see it, the more you do it, you're better at it, possibly, right? But then you also have to recognize that in this situation, I don't think any of us are professional movers, right? And I think it's safe to say that somebody who moves furniture for a living would have worked this problem out probably a lot more quickly because they're coming at it from a different perspective, right? They're coming at it from the perspective of this is what I do, this is what I understand. I can look at a table and see what the dimensions are. I automatically start thinking about how I can move that table around to fit it through the door. I might approach that problem by looking at which table looks the most difficult. Let me solve the most difficult problem, and if I can solve the most difficult problem, then what I perceive to be an easier choice is the second. And so again, the central point here is that we all had the same information, and we approached solving that problem with very different frames, or that problem was how we solved that problem was impacted by the frames with which we viewed that problem. So if you translate that into auditing, into an audit environment, right, that could be problematic. Right? That could be very problematic because one thing, what's one of the characteristics that we said lead to high quality decisions and judgments? What's a characteristic of a high quality judgment? Well, definitely from an audit perspective, we want to apply professional skepticism, definitely. Unbiased. Consistent, right? Consistent and confident. We're talking about high quality. Of course, as auditors, we should be bringing unbiased judgments. Our judgment should be unbiased. We should be skeptical. We have a question in mind. But an important factor as well is the consistency of the judgments that you make. So if you saw this image 15 times, right, you should consistently make the same judgments and be confident about it. So those are the two things we're talking about: confidence and consistency in our judgment. So what we want to do in an audit, when we're in an audit environment, is be able to confidently approach a problem the same way, given the same set of facts, right? Approach that problem and approach solving that problem with confidence and consistency. Example. So let's start with GCORP. What's the principal judgment tendency? What judgment tendency do you believe the audit manager demonstrated? Yes.
Availability and experience.
Okay. Anyone?
I think it was inquiry.
Okay. Moses?
What's going to see this in?
Okay. So, why availability?
Well, it was more on the experience side. She had prior knowledge of last year's numbers, so she's kind of like because of her knowledge of last year that she doesn't she uses that you're not supposed to use that knowledge the district is completely different. She uses
Listen, before you go on, it's okay to use it prior to knowledge, but go ahead, you're gonna finish.
but I mean it's not necessarily the most accurate.
Right, exactly. So it's okay to use prior year knowledge. We're always gonna bring our knowledge into it, right? But you don't use only that. You don't allow it to block new knowledge, right? You don't allow it to drive looking at other alternatives. So you're saying she just basically used available information, which was prior year knowledge, and anchoring. Why anchoring? What did she anchor on?
She basically based her decision on whatever that company, the other ABC auditing company or appraisal company, because she knew that it was a pretty reputable company, and she decided that their decisions probably good.
Okay, so let's just. Okay. So, Anchoring says it's a form of bias when we place too much reliance on one piece of information or a set of circumstances. You should suspend your judgment until you have considered all of the alternatives. And availability says you focus on information that can be easily recalled and related to a particular issue, or you allow others' views to influence how you address an issue. So which do you think best describes what happened in this case? Availability, right? Okay. So what happens with anchoring, it's not so much that what she did wrong or the approach she took that wasn't the most effective approach, I should say, is that, and it says in the case here, that what she did was she focused on the fact that ABC was a reputable expert. You know, they had a good reputation in doing these types of evaluations. And she also focused on last year's, right? So, and she focused on management. So she concluded that based on the fact that that ABC was a reputable company and they had done this before, and that, you know, that they obviously provided management with good assumptions. And so based on that information, right, that was the most recent retrievable from her memory was the fact that they had an expert who performed evaluation, and so therefore management's assumptions were right. And so she proceeded from that position to just do the same as last year, right? So it prevents, so a lot of times what you see is when people suffer from or engage in a judgment tendency related to availability of information, they don't see other alternatives, but also because they just do what they did last year, same as last year, south. Right? So she used the fact that the ABC was a well-respected firm, that they had competent evaluation specialists, and they had broad experience with software and technology. So she just went to similar to prior years, she just went with prior year audit procedures. And so she didn't go back and try to look at other alternatives. What did the partner do that was different from what the manager did? What did they say that the partner did when Nassim came out? He did what? Right. He didn't focus on what information was in front of him. He got additional information. Right? So what Fiona did was focus on the information. Management came in, handed her the evaluation specialist report, and they did their mathematical procedures and they tested the reasonableness of the assumption. But that's not wrong. We should test the reasonableness of the assumptions. But the reasonableness of the assumptions just tell you whether or not they use reasonable, the factors that they use in arriving at their assumptions were reasonable. But that doesn't mean that it included everything that they should have considered. It's not a matter of being reasonable or unreasonable. Yeah, their assumptions were reasonable, but their assumptions didn't go far enough. Right? It didn't consider changes in the environment from last year, right? So when the partner came in, what he did was look at information that was different from last year. So what other information should be looked at? And that's what he did. He looked at, when he came in, he realized that they didn't consider the impact of the company's risk factors. And so he looked at the 10K, right? And looked at the market information that the company disclosed in their 10K. That's information that the audit manager had as well. As a part of the audit, you have to get the 10K, right? So he looked at that information. He noticed that the cash flows were much lower than what they projected in the past. So that would tell you that maybe the projections that they used in the assumptions are not correct, because the assumptions are based on the fact that on projections that they will meet those numbers, but now you have evidence that they're not meeting those numbers, so you want to change that. So here we have, so it's a tendency to consider information that is easily retrievable. Right? That information is easily retrievable for her. She saw that as being more relevant and more important for the judgment. Why? because it involved, she concluded that the expert could be trusted. That's another form of a judgment heuristic, right? And what happens is when you engage in more, in judgment heuristics or mental shortcuts, you stop your search for information or evidence, right? It's short-circuited. Because in this case, experts can be trusted, and so therefore, I'm going to rely on the information that's easily retrievable to me that I received from the expert. As a result of that, it impacted her audit approach, right? Because we saw that she did not perform, she had her team do the same things that they did last year. That wasn't sufficient because we knew if she looked at the 10K, looked at analyst reports, she would have known that they were not very bullish on the company. That impacts the assumptions that the specialists use. The other thing that's also important is if management hires a specialist, management hired that specialist. Who does the specialist report to? Who does the specialist have a fiduciary responsibility? Management. Right. Right. Are specialists bound by generally accepted auditing standards? Do they have to be independent? Not as far as I know. Right? They don't have, they're not bound by the same standards that auditors are bound by, right? They don't have to be independent, at least not, the auditing standards don't cover these evaluation specialists, right? So an auditor has to view a specialist as a management hiring specialist. Now, granted, the information is being developed by a third party with expertise, but you still have to be skeptical about that information. You can't just say blanketly accept the information that a specialist gives you because they're a specialist. You're still responsible for getting evidence or obtaining reasonable assurance about the amounts that are presented. So it's not enough to just look at the assumptions and say, oh, they're reasonable. Okay, that's step one. But are they inclusive? Should the assumptions have been different? Should they have considered additional factors and inputs? So they relied too heavily on prior year evaluation assumptions and inputs used by ABC. Clearly there was a change in the environment, and it was evidence that was easily available to them, so to her. So she just considered the evidence that was available. So what could she have done to avoid this? How do you prevent doing that? We talked in some examples of it, but how do you avoid the availability of judgment? Right. Look at alternatives. So okay, that's exactly what Nassim did. Not just look at what the specialist gave them and what the client gave them, but in looking at the assumptions, say, okay, these assumptions are reasonable, but what other factors could have an impact on this? So question, being skeptical, let's go back and look at how they performed over time to determine whether or not those assumptions that we relied on in the past are even reasonable. Because what do you have? Assumptions are just that, right? They're forecasts, they're estimates, right? But then now you're a year later, you have more information about whether or not those assumptions were reasonable, right? Or you have more information about the change in the environment, the industry, the market that could impact those assumptions. So you want to evaluate additional evidence sources. So consider the input of others. That's what Nassim did. He looked at additional information, alternative evidence. He looked at what market analysts were saying about the company, and make an opposing case. The opposing case would have been, okay, these assumptions are reasonable, but what other assumptions? Why would these assumptions not be reasonable? What would cause these assumptions to not be reasonable in this instance? So just confirming evidence. As I said, the engagement partner did demonstrate professional skepticism. He recognized the potential impact of the company's significant risk based on the disclosures about goodwill impairment in their 10K. And so based on that, he followed through and obtained additional evidence by going outside of the company, outside of just looking at the information that the specialist provided. He looked at analysts as well. Okay. Questions on that? All right, what about Fox? What's the bias here? The judgment tendency. Yes.
I thought there was a prominence of anchoring, especially when it's the whole concept of time being immaterial. I think Bert suggested time is immaterial in terms of having goods delivered, installed in a 30-day window. And he gives this example of, he gives the reporter evidence that there's like several deliveries that account for 50% of the total revenue recognized, and they've all been successfully installed for this 30-day window. So I think he puts too much reliance on that, but even though it is 50% of the total revenue, it could be maybe in terms of total deliveries, it could be only 20% or something low, which kind of gives misinterpreted info.
Okay, so you think anchoring. I like all your reasonings.
I thought it was the confirmatory trap because university trusts Bert's opinion because he's an expert in what he does and use past information to show how that's how they've been doing sales for the last couple of years. So she relied on his expertise in the field, and that's why she didn't question it. And that's why. And the confirmatory trap basically says that if you take the preliminary conclusion based on what information you have available, then
Right. And so, and the key thing here, the reason that it's the confirmation bias, right, as opposed to anchoring, is because what she did was she looked for information to support what her initial views were. So when she went in, there's a sentence in there where they tell you that she performed analytical procedures. And then after performing these analytical procedures, she went in. So we'll cover analytical procedures in a couple of weeks, but analytical procedures are basically, during the planning stage, what an auditor does is they will gather information, preliminary information about the client, such as the financial statements for the current period, and just kind of do a comparison, ratio analysis, trend analysis, looking at changes from year 1 to year 2 and trying to identify any potential areas of concern. So analytical procedures at the planning stage are attention directed. So it's meant to direct the auditor's attention to potential problems. And so based on, so auditors, once they perform this, they have expectations by which they're evaluating the changes or the outcome of these analytical procedures. So that's what she did. She had an opinion about what, she knew about the change in the company's revenue recognition or the way that they bill their clients or perform or structure their contracts, I should say. So she knew about that. So that fit, in her mind with what she saw in the revenue changes. And then she went in and spoke to the controller, right? And his discussion met with what she expected, right? She didn't consider any other, it fit nicely. What else didn't she do? What should she have done?
Consult other team members.
Right, she probably should have spoken to other members to say, I'm not really sure about this. Can't see that.
Oh,
What you said something about the audit procedure she performed. Could you repeat that?
Audit procedure? Well, I was talking more in terms of Bert, how he mentions that he says like he puts all this information based on, he does the test where he shows the auditor that 50% of the total revenue.
That's what I was going to focus on, yeah. supports his claim. Right? So as an auditor, she should have looked at other cases. She just assumed 50% is a big number, so she assumed, oh, 50% is recognized this way. Well, the problem with that is 50% of it might not be recognized that way. 50% of those transactions might actually result in a different revenue number. So she should have looked at, it's like, that's fine, okay, so this 50% that, but let me look at a sample, or those transactions, the other 50%, the 50% that you didn't show me, and what was the outcome of that. So she suspended her judgment based on her preliminary analysis and her basically confirming what she thought. The story fit nicely for her, right? And that created a problem because, as we saw, the senior partner came in and identified other areas of concern, of things that they should have looked at. So here, the auditor the person making the decision puts more weight on a particular piece of information that's consistent with his or her initial beliefs and preferences. And what drove this to be why it's a confirmation bias is because there's a sentence in it that says she performed procedures before going in to talk to her. So she, based on those procedures, she performed some belief, she had some preference, and those explanations suited her preference. Yes.
So she probably mentioned anchoring, which is also something that initially I had thought, also because besides the fact that she was persuaded, which went in concurrent with the confirmation, she did follow the previous year's audit plan. It's at least in the text, so that's why it was one of the reasons where we felt that anchoring would also be that maybe not as good as it is confirmation.
Right, it's not, so there's several things that could happen, but so here's the thing, it's not, first of all, I want to make sure that you don't think, it's not a bad thing to follow, in most cases, it might be warranted to follow the previous year's audit plan. What I'm saying, and what you should be doing, is making sure that there are no changes in circumstances, so that it is okay to follow. To consider, before you go and jump in and follow last year's audit program, you ask yourself, are there any different factors, changes, that would suggest that this procedure is not the right procedure, or that we need to do more? Right, so it wasn't bad that she followed previous year's audit plan, but what she didn't do effectively was consider whether or not that was sufficient to do. So that's what it's not that it's a bad thing to follow previous year's audit plans. It's bad to follow it blindly without considering, an alternative way to look at it, or whether there are any changes that you should take into consideration before doing it. So an example might be where it's not a good idea to follow it would be this example, right? Because there was a significant change in their revenue, the way they generated revenue. They went from, so what they really had was a multiple deliverable type contract, right? So there were several things that needed to happen before you could determine that revenue was actually realized. So that's a huge change. And so that by itself should have triggered her to look at that maybe our existing audit, we can't follow the same audit procedures, or we need to do additional audit. We need to also perform additional audit procedures, right? And so that's the thing, and that's the part that's really important in planning, and that's some of the things that you're trying to identify in the planning phase, is are there any significant changes that would require us to rethink our audit review? So then there are situations where it's a good thing, if the company has, let's say the company has effective internal controls, they have always been very conscientious about internal controls. Once you get an understanding of whether or not controls are actually have changed. Is there been a change in the internal control environment? You do a walkthrough and you make sure that controls are operating as initially intended. Then it's okay if those tests come out that, okay, there's been no, based on our understanding, based on our walkthrough, and testing a sample, controls are operating the same way. So we're going to follow this approach of testing internal control. That makes sense unless as you go along, if you find something different, then you revise your test. But your initial approach, based on your audit planning, suggests that your approach is okay to follow that same approach. So it's not that it's always bad. It's to consider whether or not there are any changes in the accounting and the financial reporting environment, the types of transactions they're engaging in, the way they're recognizing, say for example, revenue in this case. That would say to you that maybe we need to change our approach or think about different risk factors associated with this particular revenue recognition policy. And when we talk about risk assessment and the audit approach, we'll get into that in a little bit. So the engagement, things that she should have done at the engagement, well, the things that she did was, as it pointed out, she let Bert kind of sway her views. He persuaded her. She didn't review any addition. She accepted his analysis. Again, she relied upon prior year audit procedures to confirm her judgment about the reasonableness of the company's position. So again, if you just use last year's audit procedures and just apply it to the analysis that Bert gave you, of course it's going to work out because he's giving you those cases where the recognition was exactly the way it was with last year's situation. So basically, she didn't critically evaluate the information, whereas the partner or the senior level partner, did more, right? He had more of a questioning mind. He was a lot more skeptical about the information that was presented to him. And so, again, if you notice that with this case and the GCORP case, the approaches you should take, right, is pretty simple. Is consider the input of others, look for alternative explanations, make the opposing case. Don't take this approach of just confirming your initial expectations or confirming what management tells you. You have to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture. Did you consider all of the factors? What changed this year that didn't exist last year? And how might that impact our audit approach? The critical evaluation of the evidence. Remember I talked in the beginning, it's really important to develop your critical thinking. So approach problem solving by thinking through the issues with a critical questioning mind. And that's not to say that you expect that you're going to approach the client and say, okay, I know you did something wrong and I'm going to prove it. That's not, it's trust but verify. So when we talk about professional skepticism, next week we'll go into this idea of trust but verify in more detail. So any questions about the two cases about judgment pressure? And it's important because I want, as we go, you'll see, as we start to get into the phases of the audit, especially the risk assessment phase of the audit evidence, you're going to see that you have to, as an auditor, you're going to make judgments about the risk of material misstatement, judgments about the level of control risk, judgments about the amount of testing that you should do, detection risk, given. So your judgments, you have to look, and again, there'll be a lot of information that you see. At the beginning, I used the example of the table where you all saw the same picture, had the same set of facts, want to make sure that in arriving at your judgments, you're thinking through critically of what are the alternatives, right? What are the different scenarios that why would this not be the case? Right? Instead of saying this is the case, well, okay, why would this not be the case? You know, why would we expect revenue to be different in the client's current environment? Right? Your goal as an auditor is to obtain evidence, sufficient and appropriate evidence about the amounts that reflected in the financial statements. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Any questions then about judgment? We'll come back to this again as we go through the semester. Okay. So everyone, you guys, are you familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley? Okay. So you know what the objective is. So Sarbanes-Oxley basically was a game changer for the auditing profession, because the auditing profession basically went from being self-regulating to being regulated by government entities. Sarbanes-Oxley Act addresses audits of public companies. So the PC audits or inspections of audit firms that audit public companies, and that's what the PCAOB does. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically the PCAOB audits the auditors, and if you're one of the larger public accounting firms, the PCAOB is always there. Right? They take a risk-based approach, so they select audit engagements that are that they determine to be higher risk audit engagements, and they basically come in and inspect the auditor's work, the work that they do, and they issue inspection reports. Most times, in some instances, they will name the audit firm, but that depends on different circumstances. But for the most part, they'll issue an inspection report that summarizes the findings that they come across, that they conclude upon when they have gone out and conducted several audits over a period of time. So if you look on the PCAOB website, you can see copies of the inspection reports that they issue and the types of audit issues that they come up with. So for example, I was just on there for a research project that I'm working on. One of the things that they're talking about now is for their inspections that covered, I think, the period of 2010 to 2013, one of the things that they wanted to highlight was the deficiencies that they found, or that they believe, what they believe to be deficiencies in the audits over internal controls for financial reporting. So they felt that, and I just scanned it, I have to give it more detail, but this is something that they have a concern about, that audit firms are not addressing the risk associated with internal controls and not as effectively as they think that auditors should. And as a result of that, they feel that there's been a number of audit deficiencies in terms of the audit reports related to internal controls, and then also conclusions that auditors make with respect to control risk. And here's why that is important. Although it's important to audit firms because PCAOB is identifying it as a major area. But it's also important because the auditor's assessment of internal controls impacts the risk of material in the statement. It's one of the control risk is one of the components of the risk of material in the statement. And so how an auditor assesses the risk of material in the statement will impact the nature, timing, and extent of their audit procedures. So if the auditor does not assess internal control risk effectively, so let's say they underestimate control risk. So they assess control risk lower than they should. so by doing that, that means that that's going to change the extent of the audit work that they do, the amount of audit work that they do, the type of audit procedures that they perform. So they might, for example, look at fewer transactions. If they assess it too low, they're going to look at fewer transactions. And by looking at fewer transactions, when controls are not effective, you run the risk that you will not identify a material mistake. So you increase the risk that a material mistake will go undetected. So we'll talk more about that when we get into the audit risk model. But that's why internal controls are so important. So and also Sarbanes-Oxley really led to auditors having to test internal controls. And this is only for publicly held companies. In the past, the auditors couldn't test internal controls or non-GAAP. Their decisions based on their audit approach. However, after Sarbanes-Oxley, they mandated that auditors perform, that they test internal controls and issue a report on internal controls that's available. It's a publicly available report. It's a part of the audit report. Okay, so that places a lot of importance on audits of internal controls. So this is an important step. So Sarbanes-Oxley, through and PCOB, said really does definitely drive the audit environment, right? Because they drive, in this case, they changed how audit firms were required to do certain audits, and then how they reported on those audits. And so you're all familiar with the SEC, so I'm not going to go into that. But the PCOB is as I said, one of the biggest changes that the audit profession has gone through over the last 10, 15 years. And so it has a significant impact on the major audit firms because those are the firms that are auditing public companies. So anything that I talk about with respect to the PCOB, and you'll see the standards, I'll talk about that on Thursday. There are PCAOB audit standards that audit firms have to abide by in the audit of publicly